She said good night and thought the call had ended, but her phone stayed on. What her mother heard next shattered her, mocking laughter, harsh truths, and a whispered secret that didn't add up. It wasn't just pain she felt, it was a warning. And something inside her finally woke up. It was almost a ritual, a gentle end to the day. Every night, around 9 p.m., Julia's phone would buzz with her daughter's name lighting up the screen. Same warm voice, same soft, "Good night, Mom," followed by a few minutes of small talk. Nothing deep, nothing real, but comforting, like the hum of a favorite old song playing softly in the background of a quiet life. That night was no different, at least at first. Emily said the baby had finally gone down for the night, that she was exhausted and they'd catch up more tomorrow. Julia smiled into the phone. "Sweet dreams, sweetheart," she said. Then came the click, or so she thought, but the line didn't go dead. Instead, silence hung for a moment. Then, footsteps. Shuffling. The sound of a wine glass being set down. A second voice, laughing, muffled but unmistakably close. And then Emily again, her tone now sharp, amused. "I swear if I have to do one more of those fake bedtime calls," laughter. "She still thinks they mean something. It's like talking to a sad old voicemail from the 90s. Julia froze. The voice she knew so well, always sweet, always careful, had morphed into something else entirely. Bitter, dismissive, cruel, and just when she thought she'd heard the worst of it, Emily whispered, "She still doesn't know. And we need to keep it that way. At least until after the summer." Her chest tightened. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a warning. A warning she didn't yet understand, but couldn't afford to ignore. The house was still, just like it always was at that hour. Julia sat on the edge of her bed, one hand clutching the phone, the other gripping the comforter with a quiet desperation she couldn't quite explain. The voices on the line continued, unaware of the listening ear on the other end. Emily's laughter had faded into background chatter, a man's voice now clearer. Julia recognized it. Brian, her son-in-law. Kind, polite, always respectful. When he visited, but there was something in his tone now, something smug, even cold. "She thinks you actually want to talk to her every night?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Emily sighed. "I mean, it keeps her from spiraling. I guess. God forbid she feels forgotten." "She's been clinging since your dad died," he replied. "Some people just don't know how to move on." Julia felt a sting behind her eyes. Her late husband, Richard, had passed nearly 3 years ago. A quiet man, dependable, her partner in all things, and in his absence, those calls from Emily had become her lifeline. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that they meant something to both of them. Now those words played on a loop in her mind. Spiraling, clinging. Was that how they saw her? A burden masquerading as a mother? The sounds on the other end shifted. Footsteps moving into what sounded like a kitchen. Glasses clanked. Ice dropped. A door opened, maybe the fridge. Julia sat frozen in place, her heart pounding as if she'd stumbled into a scene she was never meant to witness. Then came another. Voice, this time not Brian's. A woman. She couldn't make out the words at first, but it was enough to set off a silent alarm inside her. Whoever it was, she was familiar enough to enter Emily's home unannounced. Julia leaned in, listening harder. The woman said something about keeping the story straight. Emily responded quickly. Relax, she's not suspicious. Not yet. That was it. The phrase that twisted the knife. Not yet, there was something going on. Something bigger than casual cruelty or thoughtless gossip. Something they were actively hiding from her. Julia's mouth had gone dry. She finally ended the call with a trembling thumb and sat in silence for several minutes, her thoughts racing in every direction. For years, she dismissed little inconsistencies, brushed off moments of unease. But now, pieces were starting to fit. Things she hadn't wanted to see were staring back at her, loud and clear. And in that heavy silence, One terrible realization rose above the noise. They weren't just talking behind her back. They were planning something Julia couldn't sleep. Not even close. She spent the night in her robe, pacing the kitchen floor, the house lit only by the dim glow of the range light. Every sound from the phone call replayed in her head like a broken record, especially the laugh. That sharp, dismissive laugh Emily gave after calling her a sad voicemail from the 90s. But it wasn't just the words. It was the way she laughed. Like someone else thought it took Julia hours to place it. But just after 3 a.m., it hit her like a slap. That wasn't Emily's laugh. Or at least it hadn't started out as hers. It belonged to someone else from long ago, someone who had taught Emily how to turn sweetness into manipulation and affection into currency. It was Leslie's laugh. Leslie, Julia's younger sister, had always been a thorn disguised as a rose. Growing up, she was the charming one, the one who could talk herself out of anything, who knew exactly how to wear affection like perfume, light and sweet at first, but overwhelming if you got too close. Julia had cut ties with her years ago after one too many betrayals. She hadn't spoken her name aloud in over a decade. Could it be coincidence? Julia shook her head. Leslie had a way of seeping into people, especially the vulnerable ones. And when Emily was younger, right after her father died, she clung to Leslie like a second mother. Julia hadn't thought much of it at the time. She was grieving too. They all were. But now she wondered how much of Emily's bitterness was really her own. The more she thought about it, the more moments came back to her. The time Emily snapped at her over Thanksgiving about boundary issues. The times she'd been oddly distant right after visiting her aunt. The subtle way she started saying things like, "You wouldn't understand, Mom. It's different now." Julia had blamed herself, believing maybe she was too emotional too. Needy. But what if someone had been feeding her daughter that narrative all along? As the first light of morning cracked through the kitchen window, Julia made herself a pot of coffee she wouldn't drink. She just needed something to hold. Something warm, solid because suddenly, this wasn't just about a daughter growing distant. It was about a daughter becoming someone else. And Julia realizing, too late, that she might know exactly who had. Helped make that happen. Julia sat at the breakfast table with a legal pad in front of her, the kind she used for grocery lists and reminders. Only this time she was listing something else entirely. Every comment, every offhand remark, every moment in the last few years that had left a bruise she hadn't acknowledged. She wasn't sure what she'd do with the list. She just needed to see it. In ink dot, she titled it, "Things Emily Says When She Thinks I'm Not Listening." The first entry was easy. She still thinks they mean something. Then came another. "She's been clinging since your dad died." And then more moments she hadn't thought twice about at the time, but now, under this light, felt like cuts that had never stopped bleeding. Like when Emily canceled a visit last minute and said, "I just can't deal with your moods today." Or when she brought store-bought pie to Thanksgiving and laughed, "You always used to overdo it anyway." Or the time she snapped, "You act like I owe you something just because you raised me." Julia pressed her pen harder. The paper crinkled slightly beneath her hand. She had chalked it up to stress. Motherhood, marriage, grief. Anything but what it really was. Resentment. Deep, long-held, and possibly inherited from someone else. And what stung even more, what Julia could barely bring herself to admit, was that she had let it happen. She had been so desperate to hold on to any shred of connection that she let the tone of their relationship be dictated by crumbs of affection, rationed out on Emily's. It wasn't until she remembered one Christmas 2 years ago that her stomach truly turned. They were exchanging gifts. Julia had spent weeks knitting a blanket for her grandson, soft blue and gray with tiny initials stitched into one corner. Emily smiled when she opened it, said thank you. But that night, Julia overheard her in the kitchen whispering to Brian. She still thinks this handmade stuff matters. Like it makes up for everything. Everything. That word echoed. Julia had never known there was an everything to make up for. Had she failed that badly as a mother? Or had someone convinced her daughter that love came with strings attached, even when it didn't? She looked down at the list again. The page was half full now. And yet, one word from the night before haunted her more than any insult or jab. She still doesn't know. Know what? As she stared out the window, mind spinning, she realized the pain wasn't just emotional anymore. There was a growing knot of dread in her chest. This wasn't just about words. Something was being hidden from her, something bigger. And it had started long before that phone call. It was late afternoon when Julia finally forced herself to leave the house. The air outside was thick with summer heat, but she needed to move, to do something, anything that felt normal. She drove to the local pharmacy to pick up some vitamins and toothpaste, her hands trembling just slightly on the steering wheel. As she waited at the register, she reached for her phone not to call Emily, but to look at the call log. The timestamp from the night before still sat there, mocking her. Call duration, 27 minutes. 12 of those had been in silence. She should delete it. Let it go, but she couldn't. Instead, she opened the voice memos app and began recording. A private entry, just in case, just to have a record. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "She doesn't know I was still on the line." Back at home, she poured herself a glass of water and sat down on the couch. Her body ached with fatigue, but her mind wouldn't stop spinning. The woman's voice she'd heard in the background, that wasn't Brian's sister. It wasn't anyone from Emily's usual circle. Then it hit her. Something about the cadence, the flatness at the end of the sentences. She'd heard it before. She opened Facebook, scrolled through old messages, and landed on a comment from 3 years ago, an unexpected reply under a photo of Emily holding her newborn son. "He's perfect. Can't wait to meet him someday. Allison Martin Allison." That name hadn't crossed Julia's mind in over a decade. She and Emily had been best friends in high school, inseparable, dramatic, and a little too intense. But their friendship had ended abruptly after a falling out Julia had never fully understood. There were whispers back then that Allison had a toxic hold on Emily, that she'd started meddling in her life in ways a friend shouldn't. Julia had confronted her daughter. Once, gently, asked if something was off between them. Emily had snapped. "She's the only one who actually listens to me, unlike some people." After that, Julia never brought it up again. Eventually, Allison faded from the picture. Or so she thought, now hearing that voice again, older, colder. She was sure of it. Allison was back. Not just in Emily's life, but inside her home. Inside her plans, Julia's stomach turned. Why would Emily hide that? What possible reason could there be for keeping a woman like that a secret? She stood up too fast, dizzy with realization. This wasn't just family tension. This was calculated. Controlled. And then she remembered the words again. She still doesn't know, and we need to keep it that way. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was manipulation. Possibly orchestrated by someone who had already done damage once, and was back to finish the job. Julia hadn't opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed in years. It smelled like old paper, dried lavender, and a version of herself she barely remembered. But something, maybe instinct, maybe desperation, pulled her to it that evening. Somewhere in those dusty corners, she knew were pieces of a story she hadn't finished reading. And maybe, just maybe, the missing answers were buried inside. She flipped through photo albums, birthday cards, and bundles of letters tied with fading ribbon. Then she found the old notebook, spiral bound, frayed at the edges. Her personal journal from a time when Emily was barely out of college and the house still echoed with laughter and arguments and music. The entries were raw, filled with ordinary days and emotional ramblings. But scattered among them were things Julia hadn't remembered. Comments about Emily's behavior, moments of concern she had minimized over time. April 12th, Emily came home from Allison's acting strange again. Cold, short-tempered. She barely looked at me during dinner. May 9th. Asked her about Allison's influence. She told me I was being dramatic, said I couldn't stand anyone else being close to her. That one stung. June 22nd, I found a text she left open on her laptop. Allison telling her not to give in to guilt. What does that even mean? Julia turned the page. Her heart slowed when she saw what was scribbled at the bottom. Something she hadn't remembered writing. It's like she's rehearsing me. Like she's learning how to be a different person when she's around her. That sentence, it cut through everything. Had Allison been shaping Emily all along? And what kind of relationship had they really had? Julia had always assumed it was just a messy friendship. Teen girls. Intense, maybe unhealthy, but normal. But the more she considered the woman's voice on the phone, the more her gut screamed. This is not normal. Suddenly, the strange shift in Emily's behavior made a terrifying kind of sense. The way she began choosing her words more carefully, treating Julia like a stranger in polite conversation. The distancing hadn't been gradual, it had been methodical. Practice. And if Allison was back, then maybe the damage Julia feared hadn't just lingered. Maybe it had deepened into something unrecognizable. As she closed the notebook, one image refused to leave her mind. Her daughter whispering over the phone, thinking she was alone, saying she still doesn't know. Julia whispered aloud into the quiet house, her voice small, brittle. "No, what, Emily? What don't I know?" And in the silence that followed, she felt the first flicker of fear give way to something else, the need to find out, no matter what it cost. The grocery store was nearly empty, the sun already dipping behind the trees as Julia stepped out with 2 bags in hand, milk, crackers, a frozen lasagna she didn't even want. Her mind wasn't on food. It was stuck in a feedback loop of whispered voices and journal entries and the kind of maternal dread that only grows when no one believes there's anything to worry about. She was halfway to her car when she saw her, a woman leaning against a silver Hyundai, staring straight at her. Maybe early 40s, short blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, mirrored sunglasses. Julia didn't recognize her at first. Not exactly, but something about her presence felt familiar. Too familiar, the woman smiled. Just barely. "Julia, right?" Julia paused, caught between caution and instinct. "Yes." The woman stepped forward. Her tone was casual, but there was something rehearsed beneath it. "I thought it was you." "Sorry, I used to know Emily. Back when we were kids. I'm Allison's cousin." Julia's skin prickled. "Cousin or accomplice?" "Oh," she said. Carefully, "I didn't realize Allison was back in town." "She's not really," the woman replied, shrugging. "She just visits. Sometimes stays a little longer than planned." Julia forced a smile, trying to mask the way her heart had begun to thud. "Is that so?" The woman tilted her head. "She mentioned how close you and Emily used to be, said it's been tense lately." Something in her tone, that syrupy faux concern, made Julia's stomach turn. She recognized the manipulation. It was the same tactic Leslie used to use. Baiting kindness, testing boundaries. "I'm sorry," Julia said, gripping the handle of her cart. "Do I know your name?" The woman smirked, then dropped the answer like a hammer. "Rachel Martin, Allison's sister." There was the connection, not a cousin, a sister. And her presence in this small North Carolina parking lot? Not a coincidence. She hadn't just run into Julia. She had sought her out. Julia nodded slowly, swallowing down her rising anger. "Well, tell Allison I said hello." Rachel gave a small wave, turned, and walked off, but not before tossing a final sentence over her shoulder. "You should really talk to Emily before someone else does." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Julia stood frozen for several minutes before climbing into her car. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. Whatever was going on, whatever Emily hadn't told her, it involved more people than she thought. And now they weren't just whispering behind her back. They were stepping into her life. One by one. Julia had never been particularly tech-savvy. Her laptop was old, her inbox cluttered, and most of her digital life consisted of forwarded recipes and family photos. But that night, something told her to look. Not for anything in particular, just look. She opened her email and typed Allison into the search bar. At first, nothing. Then, way down the list, nearly 5 years back, a single message from an unfamiliar address caught her eye. Subject, just for your awareness. From ali.martin.inbox@gmail.com, her pulse quickened. She clicked it open. The message was short, oddly formal. Asterisk Julia, I'm writing because I think you deserve to know that Emily has been in touch with people she doesn't fully understand. I've tried to protect her, but there's only so much I can do if she refuses to see reason. You may not believe me, and that's fine, but keep your eyes open. Just in case, an asterisk beneath the message was an attachment. Recording 1.mov. Julia stared at it. Had she ever opened it? She couldn't remember. Her hands trembled as she clicked the file. It was audio only. Faint background noise, then 2 voices. One was unmistakably Emily's. The other, clipped, calm, almost mechanical, was Allison. They were talking about someone. At first, Julia assumed it was her, but the longer she listened, the more she realized they weren't discussing her. They were talking about a deal, something about custody, something about signing papers before a date in August. Emily kept asking, she won't fight this, will she? And Allison's reply chilled her to the bone. Not if we keep her convinced that she's still needed. Keep giving her the bedtime calls. Make her feel important. That's the only leverage left. Leverage. Julia paused the audio, covering her mouth with both hands. She felt dizzy, humiliated. Used. The calls hadn't been about connection. They were part of a strategy, a way to lull her into comfort while decisions were made without her. Maybe legal ones. Maybe about her grandson. Maybe about money. Maybe all of it. And worst of all, this email had been sitting there for years. A warning from the very person she thought was the problem. Allison had tried once to tell her something, to throw up a flare before backing away, but Julia hadn't seen it. She hadn't wanted to. She replayed the phrase again in her mind, the one whispered by her daughter just 2 nights earlier. She still doesn't know, and we need to keep it that way. Well, now she did, and for the first time in years, Julia wasn't afraid. She was angry. Julia didn't sleep that night. Not a minute. She stayed at the kitchen table, staring into the cold dregs of her coffee, heart pounding with clarity. The pieces fit now. Every fake laugh, every gaslighting comment, every cold visit, it had all been part of something bigger. Something deliberate, but the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing her own. Daughter had made a choice. Julia called Emily the next morning. Not for a bedtime ritual, not to play the doting mother, but to ask one simple thing. Can you come by this afternoon? Alone? Emily hesitated. Is everything okay? No, Julia said. But I think it's time we talk. She arrived. 2 hours later, holding a to-go coffee in one hand and wearing the same bright, casual smile Julia had seen 100 times before. The performance had become second nature. They sat on opposite ends of the living room. Julia didn't offer cookies, didn't ask about the baby. She simply pulled out the printed copy of the email, the one from Allison. Emily's smile faltered for the first time. Where did you get that? Julia's voice was steady. It was in my inbox for 5 years. Emily glanced away. Her face twitched, not guilt, not even surprise, just calculation. Like she was deciding how much truth to surrender. Finally, she spoke. I was going to tell you. Julia shook her head. Don't lie, you weren't. Silence stretched between them like a frayed rope. Emily leaned forward, her voice low. You don't understand. I needed to protect what was mine. You. You were becoming too involved, too entitled. Everything felt like a guilt trip. Julia's stomach turned. I just wanted to be part of your life, that's all. And I let you be, Emily said flatly. But I had to control how. I have a son now, a husband, a life. I didn't want you rewriting it in your image. Julia's hands tightened in her lap. So you used me? I managed you, Emily replied, as if correcting a math problem. And if that makes me cold, fine. But it kept things simple. Words hit like slaps, one after the other. But beneath the pain, Julia saw something terrifying. This wasn't a young woman under the influence of others. This was a grown adult who had fully adopted the tools she once feared. Allison hadn't twisted her. Emily had chosen this path. I'm not here to beg, Julia said finally. I just needed to know the truth, and now I do. Emily stood, brushing invisible lint from her shirt. So what now? Julia looked her in the eye. Now I choose to. No yelling, no dramatic exit. Just a quiet, resolute end to a role Julia had held on to far too long. The mother desperate to stay wanted as Emily walked out. Julia sat in the same silence that had once terrified her. But this time it felt like freedom. The days that followed were strangely quiet, not just in the house, but inside Julia herself. There were no more nightly calls. No chirping text messages or photos of her grandson with captions like, he misses. You! There was just silence, and to Julia's surprise, she welcomed it. Grief came, of course, like clockwork. She cried in the laundry room one afternoon while folding an old sweatshirt Emily had left behind years ago. She cried when she passed the baby aisle at the drugstore. But the pain wasn't rooted in loss anymore, not fully. It came from something deeper, older. The slow collapse of an illusion she protected for too long. She wasn't a bad mother. She was a human one. Imperfect, loving, sometimes too forgiving, sometimes too present. But everything she'd done had come from the same place, a place Emily had closed herself off from. One evening, Julia sat down at her desk and began to write, not an email, not a letter to Emily. This time it was a letter to herself. She wrote about how love without boundaries becomes self-erasure, about how being needed isn't the same as being valued, and how sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to step back and let people reveal who they've chosen to be. She printed it, folded it, and slipped it into the same cedar chest where her journals lived, not to revisit, just to leave. A record. 2 weeks later, a small envelope arrived in the mail, no return address. Just her name in Emily's handwriting. Inside was a single photo, her grandson, smiling in the grass, arms outstretched, and a sticky note. He asks about you. I'm not ready to talk, but I'll let you know when I'm. Julia stared at it for a long time. She didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She placed the photo on her fridge, right next to an old magnet that read, "We don't go back, we grow forward." Maybe one day they'd talk again. Maybe not. But for now, Julia had what she needed all along. The truth, her own voice, and the quiet peace that comes when you stop chasing love that only shows up in shadows. She turned off her phone, sat on the porch, and listened, really listened, to the sound of nothing at all. If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?